Hi, everybody. We're just going to wait one more minute for others to join before we get started. So just another minute. Meantime, if anyone wants to introduce themselves and say hi in the chat, you are most welcome. Great. Well, I think maybe we get started and others will join over the next few minutes. Delighted to see everybody here today. I'm Juliet Parker, the Director of ALNAP, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this HNPW session, Evidence at a Turning Point, Key Findings from the Synthesis of Inter-Agency Humanitarian Evaluations. So this session is going to share the findings from the synthesis and consider, or some of the findings, and consider the learning in the context of the current moment in the sector and the changes that are happening. The full synthesis report is going to be released soon, so do keep an eye out for that. But in the meantime, you'll be able to access a summary of key findings and recommendations on the link that's going to be shared in the chat shortly. I do recommend you take a look. It's a good read. The IAHEs present an absolute wealth of information and learning, and the summary is a very manageable 4 pages. The session today is 60 minutes long, and I promise we'll finish on time. We're going to hear from our contributors first, and then there'll, of course, be an opportunity for questions from you all. So please do share comments and questions in the chat throughout the session, and we'll pick up on as many as we can in the Q&A. We're very keen to hear your reflections, so please do feel comfortable sharing. So first, I feel a little bit nervous about this. I believe we have a poll. The poll is going to ask you to select up to 2 areas where you believe systemic improvement would have the highest impact on the humanitarian system. So let's see. There it is. Great. So please take a minute to see which 2 you would select. And hopefully we're going to be able to see results start to come in a minute. Okay, anyone who's joining, we've got a poll to start us off. You should be able to see it. And then, Hamam, when do we get to start to see the results? Here we go. Okay. Okay, so localization and national leadership with 47%, and then stronger engagement with affected communities at 41%, and more decisive collective leadership. Interesting. Okay. Thank you, everybody, very much. Let's see the extent to which that resonates with the discussion that's going to be coming up now. So we're going to start with a presentation from James Darcy. James is an independent humanitarian consultant with over 30 years of experience in policy and evaluation, including leading major interagency and UN evaluations. A former director of the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI, he contributed to the development of the Sphere Standards and drafted the Humanitarian Charter. He is also, importantly for the conversation today, the author of the synthesis report. So James, delighted to hand over to you.
Thanks, Juliet. I hope you can hear me okay. Hello, everybody. Yeah, look, I'm going to spend just a few minutes giving you some of the top lines really from the synthesis report. It's if you go to the next slide, this is something I was commissioned to do last year, but it's taken until now to get feedback, and anyway, we're about to produce the report, as Juliet said. There are three purposes behind doing this synthesis. One is to provide a compendium of evidence, if you like, for decision makers. It's quite hard for people to keep up with all the evidence, and these reports are long and detailed and so on. So part of it is a synthesis of evidence for decision makers. Part of it is also a meta-analysis, if you like, or what do we learn when we read across the evaluations? What lessons jump out for the system as a whole? And it's largely that stuff that I'll be concentrating on here now. The third is to produce recommendations for the system, and we've called them actually. They're more like a guide to reform, rather than specific prescriptive recommendations. But anyway, there are recommendations, and they are actually quite detailed. What are the evaluations? They are, well, there are 7 of them. Briefly, the Mozambique cyclone of 2019, the Ethiopia drought of 2015 to 18, the Yemen crisis, 2015 to 21, Afghanistan crisis, 2021 to 23, the Northern Ethiopia conflict of 2021 to 23, the Somalia drought, 2022-3, and the Turkey-Syria earthquake of 2023. Those all come after the introduction of the system-wide activation process, but they all predate the reset agenda. And the latest funding cuts. One thing I would say about that is that actually, in spite of them predating the latest funding cuts, underfunding and the prioritization agenda is a theme that runs throughout all of these evaluations. And how to achieve coverage with less, if you like. But essentially, if you judge it in relation to the discussion around the reset, it deals with issues that I think are long-term legacy issues that we shouldn't neglect in our current discussions about prioritization. So I hope when we've tried to, in framing the recommendations, we've tried to take account of the reset agenda and recommendations so that you can read across. One of the main themes of the evaluations is really how agencies have negotiated the space that is allowed on the one hand by host authorities and on the other hand by donors, by the available funding. Politics, of course, plays a big part in this. And the humanitarian agenda is a matter of public policy. I want to stress, and it comes out strongly in the synthesis. That includes things like international humanitarian law and the principle of humanity. We tend to treat this agenda as though it was just ours, and of course it isn't just ours. And accountability for humanitarian outcomes lies first and foremost in the political domain and in the public sphere. I was asked to, if there's a single conclusion you can come up with from all of these evaluations, what would it be? Well, it's really hard to do, but roughly I would say this, that the system is actually effective when it is properly funded and when it has sustained and secure access. That it's effective in preventing the most catastrophic outcomes from humanitarian crises, with the exception of protection, I would say, and in addressing the most acute needs, but it has a much more mixed record beyond that, and we go into this quite a lot in the synthesis. Next, please. Some of the main findings at the sort of top line level. What do the IAHEs tell us about the kinds of situations we're dealing with and the kinds of vulnerability we're dealing with? Well, it emerged that there are four main categories of acute human vulnerability that seem to form the core agenda, at least in these crises. Food insecurity, and I mean acute food insecurity. Rapid or sudden loss of livelihoods, income, and assets. Acute destitution, if you like. Acute threats to life and health, including malnutrition. And acute protection threats. And one of the themes is how those interact, how those different forms of vulnerability interact, and how our responses take account of those interactions. And the answer is often not very well, I would suggest. We looked at responses in terms of supply and demand. And by demand, I mean the needs created by the crisis situations, the needs of affected communities, but also national and local capacity, response capacity gaps, and therefore the need for external intervention. And on supply, really the humanitarian system, its capacities, its program offer, its modes of operating, and also its access, of course, to major sources of funding. Needs assessment, part of the function of needs assessment is to bridge these two things. And we found it wasn't doing it very well. That demand, especially capacity gaps, are not systematically assessed as part of needs assessment. And that supply tends to dominate that assessment. We can debate this, but that came out pretty strongly from the evaluations. The reset, of course, is a response to a supply deficit. Demand remains largely the same, including capacity deficits, response capacity deficits. A second sort of big theme is what the functions of the system are, the humanitarian system. And they range from a kind of auxiliary system, auxiliary function, I should say, support to existing in-country capacities and so on, to one of substitution. And I'll show you a picture in a minute to illustrate that and some of the problems in finding the right function, if you like. And I concluded that the failure to properly configure the collective mode of response relative to existing capacities is part of our problem. It leads to a lack of synergy and reduced impact. And we can do better. We need to do better on it. Upstream and downstream issues. This refers to the question of how well we work on issues relating to early anticipatory action on the one hand, upstream, if you like, the acute response, and then downstream, the resilience agenda. We're confused about this. We're confused. The system is confused about its roles. It needs to be much clearer than it currently is. And finally, on the hybrid nature of the system, I mean, this is something you know, and I don't need to say much about, but essentially, the system as a whole is made up of very diverse organizations, each with its own mandate, its own ways of working, and so on. It makes it very hard to coordinate. And the evaluations illustrate this. But it also has advantages. And that diversity has actually turned out to be an advantage in some contexts we could talk about. Next slide, please. This is the picture I was talking about. So I mean, it's a bit crude, I apologize, but essentially the system as it's constructed has the international donors at the top, funding a UN-led humanitarian system, both international and in-country agencies. And I think one important thing about this, I would say, is that there's the distinction between two kinds of things that the system is providing. One is goods, and in that I include assets like cash. And the other is services. And each raises very different kinds of issue. And we don't distinguish clearly enough about the kinds of challenges that are raised by both of those functions. The relationship of the goods and asset transfer to markets. We're beginning to get better at understanding that, but markets are often massively disruptive. On the services side, we've got a real problem, particularly in protracted crises, where we're trying to prop up failing state services and failing to do it because we're not equipped to do it. We do what we can. The auxiliary role, by the way, is what I mean by that is simply our role in helping make that right at the right-hand side of that picture work, our support to existing systems, as opposed to substitution down the middle. And there are all sorts of things to say about how we work with affected communities and their ways of working, their mutual aid, their remittances, and all of that, which we will come on to. Next slide, please. So some specific findings. The prevention, preparedness, early action, the upstream work, as I've described it. The humanitarian system has a really important role in acute prevention, and I say acute prevention to distinguish it from disaster risk reduction and those sorts of obviously more developmental agendas. But we don't always recognise it, and we need to better balance, I think, meeting immediate needs with addressing acute population level risks. Again, we talk a lot about need, but we don't talk enough about risk. And a lot of the risks we're talking about are population-wide, as opposed to just meeting household level needs, which is the other crucial function of the system. Those two things, of course, are related, although we're not always quite clear how. And we need to better complement a reactive role with something more proactive, I think. This is not a new observation, but the point is not to wait for the most acute symptoms of crisis, as we still tend to do. We're not good at responding to early warning. I want to say just a word on program relevance and effectiveness. There's a lot of focus on food security, and often I think that's justified, particularly where we're providing people with cash, which gives them some flexibility. We're not so good on the reduction of acute risk factors for mortality, morbidity, and physical insecurity, or physical security, I should say. We often, for example, just don't fund WASH to the extent we should. It's a huge, huge gap. And of course, we can talk a lot about protection. On effectiveness, we struggle with demonstrating effectiveness. We tend to assume benefits. Once we've done something, we sort of assume that people benefit from it. And that assumption often turns out from the evaluations not really to be true, especially when you take it over time. It's extremely inconsistent what benefit appears to be delivered at household level. Quality is a key variable that we don't much talk about. Is what you're delivering good enough to do the intended job? Sometimes it is, often it isn't. We don't monitor quality nearly enough. And one thing, just a word on resilience. Almost all the strategic plans we looked at talk about resilience and resilience strengthening and both of people and systems. We don't deliver on it. It's a false promise, I'm afraid, and is becoming ever more a false promise. We need to look at our role in this regard and get realistic and serious about it, because I think it's an agenda we should be tackling. But what exactly is our role relative to others? We need to be clear on. Finally, on this slide on protection, there's so much to say on this. The system is actually weak on prevention in terms of protection, but it's relatively stronger on remedial action. There are exceptions to that, of course, but overall, that I think is the picture, and we need to look at why that is and whether there's much more we can do on the preventive side. The lack of agreed focus and prioritization on the protection agenda in the HCTs and on this centrality of protection idea, which is there's still a lot of confusion about. We need to be much more focused on collective priorities on this. And on principles, I mean, we could talk a lot about principles. There's often just in the interagency evaluations, it emerges, there's a lot of disagreement about what a principled approach entails in practice. It keeps coming up. We can't agree red lines for engagement, for example. Again, this is partly to do with the hybrid nature of the system. But we need to be better and more consistent at it, I think. Next slide. On government engagement, on accountability to affected people, on localization, there's a lot in the interagency evaluations on this. We find it hard to come up with collective engagement strategies. And we say something about that in the synthesis. There are a lot of questions about the feedback model of AAP, what works and what doesn't work, and how actually useful a model of AAP it is. Well, there's much less in practice in terms of community engagement, community participation, which is what I would hope to find more on. Lots of constraints to localization are noted. How do you localize services, for example? That's a challenge. And there's not enough on the relative benefits and limitations of localized approaches. Localization, the last thing I would say on this is it needs investment. I mean, it's seen in the reset, I suspect, as a bit of a cost-saving thing, that you can both tick the box of localization and save money at the same time. Well, actually, localization needs investment. You need to build capacity of local organizations. It can't just be seen as an economy, but it tends to be, I think. Finally, I will say a word just on strategic leadership. That the HCTs are largely information sharing rather than decision-making bodies. That's a bit sweeping, of course, but that's the picture that emerges, and I think many of us will be familiar with that picture. They tend to be reactive rather than strategic and forward-looking. Look, there is lots of good practice to point to here. I don't mean to be all negative about this, but there are real structural weaknesses, and also there's a lack of accountability for decisions taken that we have to do more about. And we have suggestions for that in the recommendations. There's particularly the lack of strategic intent shown in the HCT agendas that we look at. Next slide.
James, I'm very sorry, but we're going rather over time. Is it possible to whiz through your last couple?
This is it. This is the last slide. Perfect. Sorry, apologies. So look, the coordinated system just needs to be clear on what business it's in and what business it's not in. It needs to define its comparative advantage relative to others in that wider humanitarian ecosystem. It needs to be clearer on its longitudinal functions: prevention, response, resilience, and on the boundary problems. It needs to better configure its role in relation to protracted crisis and really reconsider its role in rapid onset responses, I would suggest. And yeah, we need to empower HCTs and HCs to agree and concentrate on a much more focused collective agenda from the outset of a crisis. That's it. I'm not going to say any more. Sorry to run off.
That's great. Thank you so much, James. An absolute wealth of information there. And please, those online, do take a look at the summary document. The link is in the chat. Also, James, there's a couple of questions in the chat in case you feel like responding to them on chat, or we can pick them up later, around actually how you defined and applied the supply and demand terms within your analysis. Would be super interesting. Sure. So we now have time to talk to our three contributors. So I'm delighted to welcome Edward Callon. Edward is a senior UN leader with over 30 years of experience in complex emergency and development contexts, currently serving as humanitarian coordinator in Zimbabwe. He previously held resident coordinator roles in Nigeria and Jordan, and senior leadership positions with WFP across Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Also, Gabriella Wyman is Save the Children's Chief Program Delivery and Impact Officer, leading global operational strategy and program performance to drive impact for children worldwide. With nearly 25 years in the aid sector, she's played a key role in humanitarian reform and coordination, including as co-chair of the IAHC Humanitarian Working Group. And Tom Delrue is the head of the UN Resident Coordinator's Office in Turkey, with extensive experience across the humanitarian development peace nexus, early recovery, and durable solutions. He's served with OCHA, UNDP, UNEP, and the ICRC, and has contributed to key policy guidance on nexus approaches and displacement. A very warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining the conversation. Edward, I wonder if I can start with you. The synthesis notes recurring challenges around access, coordination, and government engagement. Which of these resonates most from your leadership experience in a crisis-affected context, and what would need to change for meaningful improvement?
Thank you very much, Juliet. Just checking the echo. Am I audible?
Perfect.
Great. Thank you very much, and welcome to all the colleagues who are attending this session globally. This is quite interesting, and I must say thank you to all those who have put effort into doing this cross-cutting analysis in the current realities we have to deal with today. The IAHE synthesis reflects issues that have shaped humanitarian action for more than a decade for those who have been in this business. In my experience over the years, access, coordination, and government engagement are deeply interconnected. But if I must prioritize one, it is government engagement because it determines how the other two function. In crisis settings, from my experience, everything depends on two contextual realities. First, whether there is a legitimate authority. Second, whether that authority has capacity. Where there is legitimate authority but limited capacity, which is often the case, humanitarian action must support and strengthen national leadership, not substitute for it. However, we often lack internal consensus within the humanitarian community about how to interpret the role of central authorities. That disagreement directly affects coordination models, access negotiations, and even how we apply humanitarian principles. Now, what needs to change? First, coordination must shift from what I call a power brokering model to a facilitator and enabler model. The role of resident coordinators and humanitarian coordinators cannot be to centralize influence, but to create space for collective action, especially by national actors. Second, humanitarian country teams must be leaner and more accountable. Membership should be purposeful, not automatic, and decision-making must be clearer and accountability stronger. Third, localization must be deliberate. A transition plan towards nationally led arrangements should be embedded from the onset of a response. Otherwise, we reproduce dependency rather than resilience. And ultimately, the humanitarian reset is not a technical adjustment. It's a shift in mindsets towards humility, inclusion, and principled engagement. If we get government engagement right, coordination becomes more coherent, access more sustainable, and legitimacy stronger. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, super interesting. And yeah, leadership and localization came up in our poll earlier as well. So that definitely resonates. And certainly there's plenty of findings in the synthesis around access and coordination and leadership too. Thank you so much. Gabriella, maybe I can pass to you. The synthesis suggests that the system performs strongly in averting catastrophe, but struggles with protection, localization, and collective accountability. From where you sit, which of these requires the most urgent structural?
Hi, thanks. Well, that's a very, very tough question, this one. Those are all critically important areas, and basically, maybe as a cop-out, but also as a very genuine comment. If we fail to take collective action on the centrality of protection, then as a system we have failed. Right, but if you ask me what sort of like the key structural shift is that we must make, then the answer has got to be real on locally led. That has got to be at the top of our agenda. This is something that we've been discussing for decades. Of course, since the World Humanitarian Summit, it really became more prominent, but it's been around for a long, long time. And as we heard from the synthesis, there's still an enormous amount of work to be done there. Edward also mentioned it, but it also came out of the synthesis report, working with our national and local authorities and NGO colleagues is really important. They have often better access to the affected communities, better and deeper contextual knowledge, and that longevity that they talked about, so that we can genuinely indeed be there, to reduce and minimize the impact of a crisis before it strikes, during, and after in the recovery. Now, I must also stress, of course, that not everything is best done locally. There is complementarity in the system. International actors come in when the local system has indicated that it is overwhelmed and requires international assistance. And it's important to look at how the different actors are best placed to contribute. In the reset, of course, there is this phrase, as local as possible, as international as necessary, and I think that one captures that quite well. Now, it was already mentioned, and it's also getting a lot of traction in the comments on the site, but there's a lot of barriers, of course, to locally led response. Funding flows is absolutely one of them, and colleagues are absolutely right. Locally led is not a cost-cutting exercise. Locally led requires the same amount of investment. But our funding flows at the moment are not conducive for locally led action, and that needs to be addressed. There are some capacity gaps depending on how local you go. There are due diligence requirements in the system. And of course, very often the partnership is not an equitable partnership, but a more contractual partnership. These constraints are all highlighted as well in the report. So no point in dwelling on them. But, I think if I focus a little bit more on what's going to be required to make that real structural shift, I think that genuinely requires us looking honestly at what we as an international system do best, and genuinely defining some of the comparative advantages vis-a-vis national and local actors. And it's a piece of work that the Humanitarian Working Group at the moment, among other things, is looking at. What support can international actors provide that genuinely complement national authorities and local civil society, that doesn't substitute, right? And we really genuinely need to reflect on that. There are some contexts in which we don't need to be as directly involved as we currently are, neither in coordination nor in frontline response. And there maybe focus can be more deliberately on strengthening and supporting the national response system and recovery capabilities. Now, the last point I'd make is that the synthesis report proposes this as a possible way forward. And this is, as I mentioned, something that through the Humanitarian Working Group we hope to look at a little bit more deeply. And it's something that we need to boldly take forward, so that we can hopefully continue with a stronger national and locally led response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriella. And yeah, there's a question in the chat we might get to later about AAP as the one receiving least attention and funding. Interested to hear the experiences of others if anyone else wants to respond in the chat too. I'm going to pass to Tom next. Tom, the census shows strong life-saving impact, but recurring limitations in linking humanitarian action to longer-term recovery and resilience. From your perspective, what are the core barriers the system still hasn't resolved?
Thank you very much for the question, and which is a very pertinent one, and thanks for having me. the core barrier is threefold. It's about different languages, it's about funding, and it's about systemic change. So first, we are living in two different worlds. We have different semantics, different profiles, and different coordination architectures at country and global level. We have the HCT and the UNCT, we have the Inter-Agency Standing Committee and the UN Sustainable Development Group. And although most of the constituency are the same, we speak different languages. We all speak English, but we don't understand each other. And one of the things is a semantic issue, because since most of the international aid actors are double or triple-hatted, all depending on the context they are operating in, I wonder if it would not be more conducive if we talk about human actors that are active in the humanitarian or development work stream, rather than using this opposing language of humanitarian actors versus development actors. Because if you look at the composition of all these coordination mechanisms and who's involved, either in humanitarian or development, it's for 95% the same organizations. So we have different work streams, but the actors are not either humanitarian or development. And that does not always help the conversation. Secondly, we have fragmented and disjointed funding landscape and insufficient or no timely recovery development funding in crisis and post-crisis countries. And that's partly because of the risk averseness amongst donors to come with development or recovery funding in crisis situations, and hence perpetuating humanitarian funding, very often annual response, which does not always help us to get out of this humanitarian response. Secondly, there's competition and duplication, as we all know, and we can wonder if we can still afford that competition and duplication for funding in the current context, because it doesn't really look like this is going to improve anytime soon. And there is also insufficient flexible and multi-annual funding and financing, despite the fact that all the DAC members have agreed and have endorsed the OECD DAC recommendation on the nexus. More innovative financing is also necessary, and maybe see how we can engage more with the private sector, which is very important in terms of recovery and strengthening the social fiber and getting small businesses back on track in a post-crisis situation. And then the main issue is basically, in my view, that there is no structural or systemic change as we speak. So there are a lot of good examples, there are some good examples at country level where those barriers have been overcome, but that depended mainly on individuals and on having enough people who have the same mindset at country level. So I believe that the UN80 initiative might offer an opportunity to address these, or at least some of those barriers. And I'm actually quite hopeful for two reasons. One is a bit of a negative reason. I'm hopeful that we're going to go in that direction. One, because of the unfortunate financial and humanitarian or human resources challenges that we are facing. But the good thing is that I have seen over the last 15 years that there is a shift in mindset amongst colleagues in the different work streams, and also amongst donors in the different work streams. So I think it will evolve in that direction. And unfortunately, a bit enhanced by the current financial situation that we find ourselves in. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Super interesting. Also, do keep your questions and comments coming in the chat. There's lots of interesting ones coming up there as well, some of which I hope we will be able to respond to in this second round of questions, where I'm going to ask each of the panelists, and James, I might add you to this list as well, if you don't mind. The question is, from your experience in today's constrained funding and reform environment, where does the synthesis point to the greatest opportunity for real system-wide improvement? Or as someone put it in the chat, which is the one thing we need to make sure Tom Fletcher hears? So maybe I'll pass to Edward first for your response on that one.
Juliet, thank you very much. Juliet, we are operating in a multilateral system that is becoming more transactional, less generous, more inward-looking, and less rule-based. In that context, as it is today, the IAHE synthesis recommendations, to me, are not optional. They are inevitable because these issues have plagued the humanitarian community for decades, which all of us are aware of. If I identify the greatest opportunity for real system-wide improvement, it lies in transforming financing to enable genuine localization. I repeat, transforming financing to enable genuine localization. As long as funding remains heavily earmarked, short-term, and routed primarily through international intermediaries, structural change will remain rhetorical from my experience. We need reform of the country-based full funds to remove bureaucratic barriers that prevent smaller national actors from accessing resources. We need flexible multi-year funding that strengthens institutional capacity, not just project delivery. And we must decentralize coordination to empower area-based leadership where appropriate. We have learned over the years, especially in my own case, that scarcity forces prioritization. In constrained environments, leadership must focus less on managing structures and more on maximizing life-saving impact. That requires difficult choices, including relinquishing traditional power within the system itself. The leadership model itself must evolve. The RCHC role must shift from a centralized authority to what I call an adaptive facilitator, fostering a cohesive United Nations country team around a shared vision rather than reinforcing silos, which is some of our weaknesses. At the heart of this is trust. Trust in humanitarian principles, trust in national actors, and trust in collective accountability. The synthesis shows that the system can avert catastrophe, but to be efficient, accountable, and impactful in today's environment, we must move beyond what I call tactical management towards structural reforms. The opportunity to me is clear. The real question is whether we are prepared to act on it. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, really useful on the need for the leadership model to evolve. Yeah, really super interesting. Gabriella, over to you next.
Yeah, thank you. And since Edward stole one of my responses, let me focus. Let me focus on two other ones in that case. The first one I already alluded to, the centrality of protection. You know, almost all humanitarian evaluations have highlighted that protection is one of the most persistent and problematic aspects in our humanitarian response, and certainly the centrality of protection as a collective accountability has been. The synthesis identifies some of the conceptual challenges we have with this, but it also overlaps, includes overlap and tension with the broader human rights agenda, and some of the system level weaknesses that we have. It remains, of course, as always, chronically underfunded as a sectoral intervention. And of course, also our coordination has not been as effective as it could have been with regards to protection or with regards to centrality of protection. And the humanitarian country team as a collective has really struggled to articulate and drive a truly collective protection agenda. And it is really, it's never been well executed, but it's now more important than ever, in the current environment. I really think that this is an area where we can have meaningful system-wide improvement and change. The second one that I would highlight is probably the protracted crisis. This is a really tricky one. It's easy to get into a crisis. It's always very difficult to get out, especially in contexts, that are characterized by broken systems, high insecurity, restricted access, sometimes limited government engagement. It's very difficult to know, when to start exiting. and what the appropriate role of the humanitarian system is in such a setting. It requires sustained engagement with sectors such as livelihood, resilience building that we heard today, social protection, and those are not best addressed through sort of like your annual humanitarian cycles. So as the synthesis basically noted, the transition agenda in the current reset discussion actually assumes that there is something to hand over to. And that has never really been the case, but certainly in today's environment, that is even less so the case. So a frank and system-wide discussion around this is desperately needed. And when I say system-wide discussion, I really desperately do not mean those people with their feet on the ground who are desperately trying to make something out of nothing. It's a system-wide, capitals, politicians, diplomats, ministers of finance globally, member states. That is what I mean by system-wide. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes, a very good reminder. And also, yes, a reminder of James's single conclusion from his presentation was also, the effectiveness of the system when well-funded and accessed with the exception of protection, which is clearly outside of the other trends within the sector. Tom, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And don't worry, there's still a few points that I can add to what Ed and Gabriella said, but they covered important points. Look, based on my experience in both emergency humanitarian settings, but also most recently in an upper middle income country emergency response in Turkey with the earthquakes, it's very clear that we cannot apply the same blueprint for search operations and scale-up operations or the establishment of humanitarian emergency response coordinations in all contexts. And that was very clear. There were very clear lessons learned in that regard in Turkey, which is not just a middle-income country, which is an upper middle-income country. It's almost a developed country. And so that really opened the eyes on several fronts, because the good thing about the synthesis report, which is clear, in my view, and I speak now as a humanitarian as well, written from a humanitarian and ISC perspective, it opens the door, and several points offer that opportunity to reflect on how we can change some things to enhance, I would not say per se nexus or cross-pillar approaches, but to enhance the shift of getting out of emergency response towards recovery and development. And one thing I want to say before I continue is that, Nexus is not about money. It's about political will. It's not about additional funding. It's about using the funding we have with more common sense, I would say. But first of all, what we saw in Turkey is it's very necessary that senior management in all countries, be it UNCT members or senior operations and program staff, that people on both sides of the spectrum have a sufficient understanding of the standard operating procedures on both sides of the spectrum. That people who are mainly working in a development setting or mainly experienced in development settings and suddenly find themselves in a developed country where you have a sudden onset major disaster, and they do not have any or very few understanding of how humanitarian operations are led, it makes you waste time. And so senior management, regardless which country they are, should have sufficient understanding of both sides of the coordination mechanism on both sides of the equation, including a good understanding of the refugee response. And that's even more relevant in these days with an expected increase of climate-related sudden onset disasters, which are not only hitting protracted crisis countries, but also, for example, Turkey or Spain with the floods last year, or in countries that are facing drought, desertification, and water scarcity. Secondly, we were very grateful that UNDAC was immediately deployed and the whole scale up and level 3 and clusters, but it needs to be adapted to the context. And if we're gonna deploy people with mainly a humanitarian emergency response background, and I've been part of that when I was with OCHA and the early recovery cluster, I think it's time to go to a diversification of profiles amongst the UNDAC and the first responders. So that we also have some people in those teams who understand how central governments function, and when you're deployed in countries where you have a strong government that is functioning. And the second point in that regard, rather than establishing a blueprint, new emergency coordination structure, it's important to adapt existing functioning coordination structures. And the synthesis refers to that. Because if you build on existing functioning coordination structures, it's going to be easier to move back again from that emergency setting or coordination towards the recovery and development coordination, and that is not what happened in Turkey. Despite some people suggesting that, no, the agencies wanted to have this special, separate emergency coordination mechanism. OCHA did a great job, UNDAC did a great job, but it was actually adding on one coordination structure on the development coordination structure we had already and on the refugee coordination structure. And so what we did kind of new here is that since there is no OCHA in Turkey, we deployed 2 people from the resident coordinator's office in Ankara to the earthquake region to coordinate along with OCHA. And so by the time OCHA left, that we were in place to go back not to normal, but to the new normal with the colleagues that were there before, during, and after. And that helped a lot, because normally resident coordinators office, they are not really involved in emergency coordination. But we did it to make sure that we would have a smooth and timely shift towards, again, the recovery. Because once the flash appeal period is over, these first responders, they leave from one day to another. And if that transition to go back to the other coordination mechanism is not taken care of, things fall apart. Edward already mentioned the role of national authorities. That's even more important in middle-income countries, where you usually have a functioning government apparatus and where you cannot just come in and start doing your business as usual, because they want to be in control. So that is localization for sure, but both Gabriela and Edward mentioned that already. And again, localization is not about money. It's about political will. That's what it is. It's not about dollars, in my view. I've seen it in a lot of countries. It's quite shocking that after 10 years of grand bargain, we have what, 7% that goes directly to national actors. I mean, come on, guys. And then the last one is preparedness, and that I find a very interesting one, James, because you opened the door there as well in your report to look at it differently. When I was working on the humanitarian side of the response, we see preparedness popping up in humanitarian response plans and flash appeals or whatever. Where does preparedness belongs? In cooperation frameworks. You don't start with preparedness during a response. Right. It's too late. Preparedness is basically a development issue. And preparedness should be taken into account in every country where we work, whether it's an emergency or crisis or not, because Turkey clearly proved that a big disaster can happen anywhere at any time. And if there's no preparedness, it's too late to start talking about preparedness and raising funding for preparedness in your flash appeal or in your HRP. It's too late. Preparedness, that's precisely what it means. So I think these are just 5 points where I was very happy to see that this humanitarian evaluation actually opened the door, at least on those 5 fronts, to start thinking outside the box. So thanks for that, James.
Thank you very much. We've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to pass to James as well with the same question. What's the one thing that we should be taking forward from what you saw within the synthesis?
Okay, well, like Tom, I'm not going to give you one, but I'm not going to say much because I've said a lot. I'm going to cheat. So 3 things. Adapt your structures and systems to the context. It came out so strongly from what Tom just said. Just get smarter, guys. Related to that, point number 2, ours should be an enabling function. Above all else, an enabling function. We forget that. And this goes back to what Ed said as well. You know, we get so tied up in our own coordination mechanism processes and so on. Honestly, we need to just think differently about our role and function in so many contexts. I know that's a broad point, but it needs to be said. And I like what Gabrielle said. The centrality of protection stuff, I think we can all agree on. We need to be much clearer on it. And in protracted crises, transition is indeed a key issue, but I've yet to see what that is supposed to look like. We don't have clear models for this, and we can't go on as we are. But transition to what is the question, and with whom, and how? How do we enable transition? Tom actually gave a rather good example of that, I thought, just now. So take transition seriously, but be hard-headed and pragmatic about it. And that's all I will say.
Great, thank you very much. Just looking at a few of the questions, there was one around the ISC, if this was being presented to the ISC in various different fora, and that's been responded to. So my understanding is that yes, it has, and it will be. There was another about ISC integrating national and local representatives, in case anyone wants to pick up on that. And the royal we, an assumption that we know what we is that a part of the problem, which Gabrielle has given a partial response to. And also a final one about, are the findings coming out of the synthesis still too general? Is the reality more nuanced, and therefore, do we need more specificity around all of them? Part of the answer, I guess, is to go back to the original IAHE evaluations as well. But I wonder if any of you would like to pick up on any of those points about, I suppose, usability and how this synthesis will be can be used going forwards. We only have about 3 minutes. If anyone from the panel would like to respond. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I would be personally, I think it would be good if we would, and I'm going to contribute to that this synthesis report does not only circulates amongst the colleagues that are mainly working on the humanitarian side of the equation. Because I read it now, both as a humanitarian and someone working on the development side, because I'm in an RC office. It's equally important for both sides of the spectrum. Also for colleagues who might never have worked on the humanitarian side, it is equally important because the points that I mentioned at the end, the synthesis report gives some, how would I say, centers. They're opportunities to think beyond the humanitarian response, because if we're going to keep this discussion only amongst humanitarian responders, we're going to have the same evaluation 5 years from now. So it would be good, and I will contribute to that as well, if the report circulates beyond the IEC members, but also amongst the people that are mainly working on the development side of things. I think that could be helpful.
Yeah, brilliant. Excellent reminder. Thank you very much. Any final comments from any other panelists?
No, I think I just steal Silva's comment because I really like it. A lot of people are already paid for. What we ask them to do, what we ask them to prioritize is another matter. And we are indeed in the system often bogged down by having to account and justify ourselves upward. And that is only going to get more complicated. So back to the point on accountability to affected populations in that case, a little bit more freedom, more flexible funding, less reporting, more trust in the system, so that we can actually be accountable to affected population, elevating the response from this very projectized way of working to a more program way of working. And that will allow us to elevate our reporting to the impact level rather than the, at best output level that a project can deliver. That would really free up the system. But that requires donors to trust organizations to deliver program interventions rather than this very projectized way of working.
Great. My goodness, that would be a very positive shift for the future. It would change all of our lives in the system. We're out of time. So I want to say thank you very much, everybody, for your attendance and engagement and the chat in the, your comments in the chat. Also, a particular thank you to our panelists, Tom, Edward, Gabriella, and James. It's really been a pleasure, and very much look forward to continuing the conversation in any way that we can. And please do keep an eye out for the synthesis in the coming weeks when it gets published. Thank you, everybody, very much for your time and attention, and be in touch again sometime.